The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 2. Copyright 1957 by Will Durant. Copyright renewed 1985 by Ethel B. Durant. This recording of the full-length reading of The Reformation, Part 2, was published by arrangement with Monica Ariel Mile, Trustee, Ethel B. Durant Trust, Monica Ariel Mile, and William James Durant Easton, and was produced in 1997 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Books on Tape Incorporated. This book is read by Alexander Adams. The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 2. This part consists of chapters 16 through 28. Book 2, The Religious Revolution, 1517 to 1564. Chapter 16, Luther, The Reformation in Germany, 1517 to 1524. 1. Tetzel. On March 15th, 1517, Pope Leo X promulgated the most famous of all indulgences. It was a pity, yet just, that the Reformation should strike during a pontificate that gathered into Rome so many of the fruits and so much of the spirit of the Renaissance. Leo, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was now head of the Medici family, which had nourished the Renaissance in Florence. He was a scholar, a poet, and a gentleman, kindly and generous, in love with classical literature and delicate art. His morals were good in an immoral milieu. His nature inclined to a gaiety pleasant and legitimate, which set an example of happiness for a city that a century before had been destitute and desolate. All his faults were superficial, except his superficiality. He made too little distinction between the good of his family and that of the Church, and wasted the funds of the papacy on questionable poets and wars. He was normally tolerant, enjoyed the satire directed against ecclesiastics in Erasmus's Praise of Folly, and practiced, with occasional lapses, the unwritten agreement by which the Renaissance Church accorded considerable freedom to philosophers, poets, and scholars who addressed themselves, usually in Latin, to the educated minority, but who left the irreplaceable faith of the masses undisturbed. The son of a banker, Leo was accustomed to spending money readily and chiefly on others. He inherited full papal coffers from Julius II and emptied them before he died. Perhaps he did not care much for the massive basilica that Julius had planned and begun, but the old St. Peter's was beyond repair, immense sums had been poured into the new one, and it would be a disgrace to the Church to let that majestic enterprise abort. Possibly with some reluctance, he offered the indulgence of 1517 to all who would contribute to the cost of completing the great shrine. The rulers of England, Germany, France, and Spain protested that their countries were being drained of wealth, their national economies were being disturbed by repeated campaigns for luring money to Rome. Where kings were powerful, Leo was considerate. He agreed that Henry VIII should keep a fourth of the proceeds in England. He advanced a loan of 175,000 ducats to King Charles I, the later Emperor Charles V, against expected collections in Spain, and Francis I was to retain part of the sum raised in France. Germany received less favored treatment, having no strong monarchy to bargain with the Pope. However, the Emperor Maximilian was allotted a modest 3,000 florins from the receipts, and the Fuggers were to take from the collections the 20,000 florins that they had loaned to Albrecht of Brandenburg to pay the Pope for his confirmation as Archbishop of Mainz. Unfortunately, that city had lost 3 archbishops in 10 years, between 1504 and 1514, and had twice paid heavy confirmation fees. To spare it from paying a third time, Albrecht borrowed. Now Leo agreed that the young prelate should manage the distribution of the indulgence in Magdeburg and Halberstadt, as well as in Mainz. An agent of the Fuggers accompanied each of Albrecht's preachers, checked expenses and receipts, and kept one of the keys to the strongbox that held the funds. Albrecht's principal agent was Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar who had acquired skill and reputation as a money-raiser. Since 1500, his main occupation had been in disposing of indulgences. Usually, on these missions, he received the aid of the local clergy. When he entered a town, a procession of priests, magistrates, and pious laity welcomed him with banners, candles, and song, and bore the bull of indulgence aloft on a velvet or golden cushion, while church bells pealed and organs played. So propped, Tetzel offered, in an impressive formula, a plenary indulgence to those who would penitently confess their sins and contribute according to their means to the building of a new St. Peter's. May our Lord Jesus Christ have mercy on thee, and absolve thee by the merits of his most holy passion. And I, by his authority, that of his blessed apostles Peter and Paul, and of the most holy Pope, granted and committed to me in these parts, do absolve thee, first from all ecclesiastical censures, in whatever manner they may have been incurred, and then from all thy sins, transgressions, and excesses, how enormous soever they may be, even from such as are reserved for the cognizance of the Holy See. And as far as the keys of the Holy Church extend, I remit to you all punishment which you deserve in purgatory on their account, and I restore you to the holy sacraments of the Church, and to that innocence and purity which you possessed at baptism, so that when you die the gates of punishment shall be shut, and the gates of the paradise of delight shall be opened. And if you shall not die at present, this grace shall remain in full force when you are at the point of death. In the name of Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. This splendid bargain for a believer was in harmony with the official conception of indulgences for the living. Tetzel was again within the letter of his archiepiscopal instructions when he dispensed with preliminary confession if the contributor applied the indulgence to a soul in purgatory. Says a Catholic historian, "There is no doubt that Tetzel did, according to what he considered his authoritative instructions, proclaim as Christian doctrine that nothing but an offering of money was required to gain the indulgence for the dead, without there being any question of contrition or confession. He also taught, in accordance with the opinion then held, that an indulgence could be applied to any given soul with unfailing effect. Starting from this assumption, there is no doubt that his doctrine was virtually that of the drastic proverb, 'As soon as the money in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory's fire springs.' The papal bull of indulgence gave no sanction whatever to this proposition. It was a vague scholastic opinion, not any doctrine of the Church. Myconius, the Franciscan friar, perhaps hostile to the Dominicans, heard Tetzel perform, and reported, for this year 1517, "It is what this ignorant monk said and preached. He gave sealed letters stating that even the sins which a man was intending to commit would be forgiven. The Pope, he said, had more power than all the apostles, all the angels and saints, more even than the Virgin Mary herself, for these were all subject to Christ, but the Pope was equal to Christ." This is probably an exaggeration, but that such a description could be given by an eyewitness suggests the antipathy that Tetzel aroused. A like hostility appears in the rumor mentioned skeptically by Luther, which quoted Tetzel as having said at Halle that even if per impossibile a man had violated the Mother of God, the indulgence would wipe away his sin. Tetzel obtained certificates from civil and ecclesiastical authorities at Halle that they had never heard the story. He was an enthusiastic salesman, but not quite conscienceless. He would have escaped history had not he approached too closely to the lands of Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. Frederick was a pious and provident ruler. He had no theoretical objection to indulgences. He had gathered 19,000 saintly relics into his castle church at Wittenberg, and had arranged to have an indulgence attached to their veneration. He had procured another indulgence for contributors to the building of a bridge at Torgau, and had engaged Tetzel to advertise the benefits of that pontifical indulgence. However, he had withheld from Pope Alexander VI in 1501 the sum raised in electoral Saxony by an indulgence for donations to a crusade against the Turks. He would release the money, he said, when the crusade materialized. It did not. Frederick the Wise kept the funds and applied them to the University of Wittenberg. Now, moved by reluctance to let Coin of Saxony emigrate, and perhaps by reports of Tetzel's hyperboles, he forbade the preaching of the 1517 indulgence in his territory. But Tetzel came so close to the frontiers that people in Wittenberg crossed the border to obtain the indulgence. Several purchasers brought these papal letters to Martin Luther, professor of theology in the university, and asked him to attest their efficacy. He refused. The refusal came to Tetzel's ears. He denounced Luther and became immortal. He had underestimated the pugnacity of the professor. Luther quickly composed in Latin 95 theses, which he entitled Disputatio pro declaratione virtutis indulgentiarum, disputation for clarification of the power of indulgences. He did not consider his propositions heretical, nor were they indubitably so. He was still a fervent Catholic who had no thought of upsetting the Church. His purpose was to refute the extravagant claims made for indulgences and to correct the abuses that had developed in their distribution. He felt that the facile issuance and mercenary dissemination of indulgences had weakened the contrition that sin should arouse, had indeed made sin a trivial matter to be amicably adjusted over a bargain counter with a peddler of pardons. He did not yet deny the papal power of the keys to forgive sins. He conceded the authority of the Pope to absolve the confessing penitent from the terrestrial penalties imposed by churchmen. But in Luther's view, the power of the Pope to free souls from purgatory, or to lessen their term of punishment there, depended not on the power of the keys, which did not reach beyond the grave, but on the intercessory influence of papal prayers, which might or might not be heard. Theses 20-22. Moreover, Luther argued, all Christians shared automatically in the treasury of merits earned by Christ and the saints, even without the grant of such a share by a papal letter of indulgence. He exonerated the popes from responsibility for the excesses of the preachers, but slyly added, "This unbridled preaching of pardons makes it no easy matter even for learned men to rescue the reverence due the Pope from the shrewd questionings of the laity, to wit, why does not the Pope empty purgatory for the sake of holy love and of the dire need of the souls that are there, if he redeems a number of souls for the sake of miserable money with which to build a church?" Theses 81 and 82. At noon on October 31st, 1517, Luther affixed his theses to the main door of the castle church of Wittenberg. Annually, on November 1st, All Saints' Day, the relics collected by the elector were displayed there, and a large crowd could be expected. The practice of publicly announcing theses, which the proponent offered to defend against all challengers, was an old custom in medieval universities, and the door that Luther used for his proclamation had been regularly employed as an academic bulletin board. To the theses he prefixed an amiable invitation. Out of love for the faith and the desire to bring it to light, the following propositions will be discussed at Wittenberg under the chairmanship of the Reverend Father Martin Luther, Master of Arts and Sacred Theology, and lecturer in ordinary on the same at that place. Wherefore he requests that those who are unable to be present and debate orally with us may do so by letter. To make sure that the theses would be widely understood, Luther had a German translation circulated among the people. With characteristic audacity, he sent a copy of the theses to Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz. Courteously, piously, unwittingly, the Reformation had begun. 2. The Genesis of Luther. What circumstances of heredity and environment had molded an obscure monk in a town of 3,000 souls into the David of the religious revolution? His father Hans was a stern, rugged, irascible anti-clerical. His mother was a timid, modest woman much given to prayer. Both were frugal and industrious. Hans was a peasant at Mura, then a miner at Mansfeld. But Martin was born at Eisleben on November 10, 1483. 6 other children followed. Hans and Greta believed in the rod as a magic wand for producing righteousness. Once, says Martin, his father beat him so assiduously that for a long time they were open enemies. On another occasion, for stealing a nut, his mother thrashed him till the blood flowed. Martin later thought that the severe and harsh life I led with them was the reason that I afterward took refuge in the cloister and became a monk. The picture of deity which his parents transmitted to him reflected their own mood. A hard father and strict judge, exacting a joyless virtue, demanding constant propitiation, and finally damning most of mankind to everlasting hell. Both parents believed in witches, elves, angels, and demons of many kinds and specialties, and Martin carried most of these superstitions with him to the end. A religion of terror in a home of rigorous discipline shared in forming Luther's youth and creed. At school in Mansfeld there were more rods and much catechism. Martin was flogged 15 times in one day for misdeclining a noun. At 13 he was advanced to a secondary school kept by a religious brotherhood at Magdeburg. At 14 he was transferred to the school of St. George at Eisenach, and had 3 relatively happy years lodging in the comfortable home of Frau Cotta. Luther never forgot her remark that there was nothing on earth more precious to a man than the love of a good woman. It was a boon that he took 42 years to win. In this healthier atmosphere he developed the natural charm of youth, healthy, cheerful, sociable, frank. He sang well and played the lute. In 1501 his prospering father sent him to the university at Erfurt. The curriculum centered around theology and philosophy, which was still scholastic, but Occam's nominalism had triumphed there, and presumably Luther noted Occam's doctrine that popes and councils could err. He found scholasticism in any form so disagreeable that he complimented a friend on not having to learn the dung that was offered as philosophy. There were some mild humanists at Erfurt. He was very slightly influenced by them. They did not care for him when they found him in earnest about the other world. He learned a little Greek and less Hebrew, but he read the major Latin classics. In 1505 he received the degree of Master of Arts. His proud father sent him, as a graduation present, an expensive edition of the Corpus Juris, and rejoiced when his son entered upon the study of law. Suddenly, after 2 months of such study, and to his father's dismay, the youth of 22 decided to become a monk. The decision expressed a contradiction in his character. Vigorous to the point of sensuality, visibly framed for a life of normal instincts, and yet infused by home and school with the conviction that man is by nature sinful, and that sin is an offense against an omnipotent and punishing God, he had never in thought or conduct reconciled his natural impulses with his acquired beliefs. Passing presumably through the usual erotic experiments and fantasies of adolescence, he could not take these as stages of development, but viewed them as the operations of a Satan dedicated to snaring souls into irrevocable damnation. The conception of God that had been given him contained hardly any element of tenderness. The consoling figure of Mary had little place in that theology of fear, and Jesus was not the loving son who could refuse nothing to his mother. He was the Jesus of the Last Judgment so often pictured in the churches, the Christ who had threatened sinners with everlasting fire. The recurrent thought of hell darkened a mind too intensely religious to forget it in the zest and current of life. One day, as he was returning from his father's house to Erfurt, in July of 1505, he encountered a frightful storm. Lightning flashed about him and struck a nearby tree. It seemed to Luther a warning from God that unless he gave his thoughts to salvation, death would surprise him unshriven and damned. Where could he live a life of saving devotion? Only where 4 walls would exclude or ascetic discipline would overcome the world, the flesh, and the devil. Only in a monastery. He made a vow to St. Anne that if he survived that storm, he would become a monk. There were 20 cloisters in Erfurt. He chose one known for faithful observance of monastic rules, that of the Augustinian eremites. He called his friends together, drank and sang with them for what he told them was the last time, and on the morrow he was received as a novice in a monastery cell. He performed the lowliest duties with a proud humility. He recited prayers in self-hypnotizing repetition. He froze in an unheated cubicle. He fasted and scourged himself in the hope of exorcising devils from his body. I was a pious monk, and so strictly observed the rules of my order that if ever a monk got into heaven by monkery, so should I also have gotten there. If it had lasted longer, I should have tortured myself to death with watching, praying, reading, and other work. On one occasion, when he had not been seen for several days, friends broke into his cell and found him lying senseless on the ground. They had brought a lute. One played it. He revived and thanked them. In September 1506 he took the irrevocable vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and in May 1507 he was ordained a priest. His fellow friars gave him friendly counsel. One assured him that the passion of Christ had atoned for the sinful nature of man, and had opened to redeemed man the gates of paradise. Luther's reading of the German mystics, especially of Tauler, gave him hope of bridging the awful gap between a naturally sinful soul and a righteous, omnipotent God. Then a treatise by John Hus fell into his hands, and doctrinal doubts were added to his spiritual turmoil. He wondered why a man who could write so Christianly and so powerfully had been burned. I shut the book and turned away with a wounded heart. Johann von Staupitz, provincial vicar of the Augustinian eremites, took a fatherly interest in the troubled friar, and bade him replace asceticism with careful reading of the Bible and St. Augustine. The monks expressed their solicitude by giving him a Latin Bible, then a rare possession for an individual. One day in 1508 or 1509, he was struck by a sentence in St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, "The just shall live by faith." Slowly these words led him to the doctrine that man can be justified, that is, made just and therefore saved from hell, not by good works, which could never suffice to atone for sins against an infinite deity, but only by complete faith in Christ and in his atonement for mankind. In Augustine, Luther found another idea that perhaps renewed his terror, predestination, that God, even before the creation, had forever destined some souls to salvation, the rest to hell. and that the elect had been chosen by God's free will to be saved by the divine sacrifice of Christ. From that consistent absurdity he fled back again to his basic hope of salvation by faith. In 1508, by the recommendation of Staupitz, he was transferred to an Augustinian monastery at Wittenberg and to the post of instructor in logic and physics, then professor of theology in the university. Wittenberg was the northern capital, seldom the residence, of Frederick the Wise. The contemporary pronounced it a poor, insignificant town with little, old, ugly wooden houses. Luther described the inhabitants as beyond measure drunken, rude, and given to reveling. They had the reputation of being the amplest drinkers in Saxony, which was rated the most drunken province of Germany. 1 mile to the east, said Luther, civilization ended and barbarism began. Here, for the most part, he remained to the close of his days. He must have become by this time an exemplary monk, for in October 1510 he and a fellow friar were sent to Rome on some obscure mission for the Augustinian eremites. His first reaction on sighting the city was one of pious awe. He prostrated himself, raised his hands, and cried, "Hail to thee, O holy Rome!" He went through all the devotions of a pilgrim, bowed reverently before saintly relics, climbed the Scala Santa on his knees, visited a score of churches, and earned so many indulgences that he almost wished his parents were dead so that he might deliver them from purgatory. He explored the Roman Forum, but was apparently unmoved by the Renaissance art with which Raphael, Michelangelo, and 100 others were beginning to adorn the capital. For many years after this trip he made no extant comment on the worldliness of the Roman clergy or the immorality then popular in the Holy City. 10 years later, however, and still more in the sometimes imaginative reminiscences of his table talk in old age, he described the Rome of 1510 as an abomination. The popes as worse than pagan emperors, and the papal court as being served at supper by 12 naked girls. Very probably he had no entry to the higher ecclesiastical circles, and had no direct knowledge of their unquestionably easy morality. After his return to Wittenberg in February of 1511, he was rapidly advanced in the pedagogical scale, and was made provincial vicar-general of his order. He gave courses in the Bible, preached regularly in the parish church, and carried on the work of his office with industry and devotion. Says a distinguished Catholic scholar, his official letters breathe a deep solicitude for the wavering, a gentle sympathy for the fallen. They show profound touches of religious feeling and rare practical sense, though not unmarred with counsels that have unorthodox tendencies. The plague which afflicted Wittenberg in 1516 found him courageously at his post, which, in spite of the concern of his friends, he would not abandon. Slowly, during these years, 1512 to 1517, his religious ideas moved away from the official doctrines of the Church. He began to speak of our theology in contrast with that which was taught at Erfurt. In 1515 he ascribed the corruption of the world to the clergy, who delivered to the people too many maxims and fables of human invention, and not the scriptural word of God. In 1516 he discovered an anonymous German manuscript, whose mystic piety so supported his own view of the utter dependence of the soul for salvation on divine grace that he edited and published it as Theologia Germanica, or Deutsche Theologia. He blamed the preachers of indulgences for taking advantage of the simplicity of the poor. In private correspondence he began to identify the Antichrist of John's first epistle with the Pope. In July 1517, invited by Duke George of Albertine Saxony to preach in Dresden, he argued that the mere acceptance of the merits of Christ assured the believer's salvation. The Duke complained that such stress on faith rather than virtue would only make the people presumptuous and mutinous. 3 months later, the reckless friar challenged the world to debate the 95 theses that he had posted on Wittenberg Church. 3. The Revolution takes form. Cranach's woodcut of 1520 may reasonably suggest the Luther of 1517, a tonsured monk of middle stature, temporarily slender, with large eyes of serious intent, larger nose and resolute chin, a face not pugnaciously but quietly announcing courage and character. Yet it was honest anger rather than jejune audacity that wrote the theses. The local bishop saw nothing heretical in them, but mildly advised Luther to write no more on the subject for a while. The author himself was at first dismayed by the furor he had aroused. In May 1518 he told Staupitz that his real ambition was to lead a life of quiet retirement. He deceived himself. He relished battle. The theses became the talk of literate Germany. Thousands had waited for such a protest, and the pent-up anti-clericalism of generations thrilled at having found a voice. The sale of indulgences declined, but many champions rose to meet the challenge. Tetzel himself, with some professional aid, replied in 106 antitheses in December of 1517. He made no concessions or apologies, but gave at times an uncompromising, even dogmatic sanction to mere theological opinions that were hardly consonant with the most accurate scholarship. When this publication reached Wittenberg, a hawker offering it for sale was mobbed by university students, and his stock of 800 copies was burned in the market square, a proceeding of which Luther joyously disapproved. He answered Tetzel in A Sermon on Indulgences and Grace, concluding with characteristic defiance. If I am called a heretic by those whose purses will suffer for my truths, I care not much for their brawling. For only those say this whose dark understanding has never known the Bible. Jakob von Hoogstraten of Cologne thundered invectives against Luther and suggested burning him at the stake. Johann Eck, vice-chancellor of the University of Ingolstadt, issued a pamphlet, Obleshi, in March of 1518, which charged Luther with disseminating Bohemian poison, the heresies of Hus, and subverting all ecclesiastical order. In Rome, Sylvester Prierius, papal censor of literature, published a dialogue maintaining the absolute supremacy of the Pope in terms not altogether free from exaggeration, especially stretching his theory to an unwarrantable point in dealing with indulgences. Luther countered in a Latin brochure, Resolutiones, in April of 1518, copies of which he sent to his local bishop and to the Pope, in both cases with assurances of orthodoxy and submission. The text spoke quite handsomely of Leo X. Although there are in the Church both very learned and very holy men, it is nevertheless the infelicity of our age that even they cannot succor the Church. Now at last we have a most excellent pontiff, Leo X, whose integrity and learning are a delight to all good men's ears. But what can that most benign of men do alone in so great a confusion of affairs, worthy as he is to reign in better times? In this age we are worthy only of such popes as Julius II and Alexander VI. Rome herself, yea, Rome most of all, now laughs at good men. In what part of the Christian world do men more freely make a mock of the best bishops than in Rome, the true Babylon? To Leo directly he professed an unwonted humility. Most blessed Father, I offer myself prostrate at the feet of your holiness with all that I am and have. Quicken, slay, call, recall, approve, reprove, as may seem to you good. I will acknowledge your voice as the voice of Christ, residing and speaking in you. If I have deserved death, I will not refuse to die. However, as Leo's advisers noted, the Resolutiones affirmed the superiority of an ecumenical council to the Pope, spoke slightingly of relics and pilgrimages, denied the surplus merits of the saints, and rejected all additions made by the popes in the last 3 centuries to the theory and practice of indulgences. As these were a prime source of papal revenue, and Leo was at his wits' end to finance his philanthropies, amusements, and wars, as well as the administration and building program of the Church, the harassed pontiff, who at first brushed the dispute aside as a passing fracas among monks, now took the matter in hand, and summoned Luther to Rome on July 7th, 1518. Luther faced a critical decision. Even if the most genial of popes should treat him leniently, he might find himself politely silenced and buried in a Roman monastery, to be soon forgotten by those who now applauded him. He wrote to Georg Spalatin, chaplain to Elector Frederick, suggesting that German princes should protect their citizens from compulsory extradition to Italy. The elector agreed. He had a high regard for Luther, who had made the University of Wittenberg prosper. And besides, Emperor Max, seeing in Luther a possible card to play in diplomatic contests with Rome, advised the elector to take good care of that monk. At this very time the emperor had summoned an imperial diet to meet at Augsburg to consider the Pope's request that it should tax Germany to help finance a new crusade against the Turks. The clergy, Leo proposed, should pay 1/10, the laity 1/12 of their income, and every 50 householders should furnish 1 man. The Diet refused. On the contrary, it firmly restated the grievances that were providing the background of Luther's success. It pointed out to the papal legate that Germany had often taxed herself for crusades, only to see the funds used for other papal purposes. that the people would vigorously oppose any further remission of money to Italy, that the annats, confirmation fees, and costs of canonical litigation referred to Rome were already an intolerable burden, and that German benefices were given as plums to Italian priests. So bold a rejection of papal requests, said one delegate, had never been known in German history. Noting the spirit of rebellion among the princes, Maximilian wrote to Rome advising caution in the treatment of Luther, but promising cooperation in suppressing heresy. Leo was disposed or compelled to lenience. Indeed, a Protestant historian has ascribed the triumph of the Reformation to the moderation of the Pope. He put aside the order for Luther's appearance in Rome. Instead, he bade him present himself at Augsburg before Cardinal Cajetan and answer charges of indiscipline and heresy. He instructed his legate to offer Luther full pardon and future dignities if he would recant and submit. Otherwise, the secular authority should be asked to send him to Rome. About the same time, Leo announced his intention of presenting to Frederick an honor that the pious elector had long coveted, that golden rose which the popes bestowed upon secular rulers whom they wished to signalize with their highest favor. Probably Leo now offered to support Frederick as successor to the imperial crown. Armed with an imperial safe-conduct, Luther met Cajetan at Augsburg from October 12th to October 14th, 1518. The cardinal was a man of great theological learning and exemplary life, but he misread his function to be that of judge, not diplomat. As he saw the matter, it was primarily a question of ecclesiastical discipline and order. Should a monk be allowed to criticize publicly his superiors, to whom he had vowed obedience, and to advocate views condemned by the Church? Refusing to discuss the right or wrong of Luther's statements, he demanded a retraction and a pledge never again to disturb the peace of the Church. Each lost patience with the other. Luther returned impenitent to Wittenberg. Cajetan asked Frederick to send him to Rome. Frederick refused. Luther wrote a spirited account of the interviews, which was circulated throughout Germany. In forwarding it to his friend Wenzel Link, he added, "I send you my trifling work that you may see whether I am not right in supposing that, according to Paul, the real Antichrist holds sway over the Roman court. I think he is worse than any Turk." In a milder letter to Duke George, he asked that a common reformation should be undertaken of the spiritual and temporal estates, his first known use of the word that was to give his rebellion its historic name. Leo continued his efforts for conciliation. By a bull of November 9th, 1518, he repudiated many of the extreme claims for indulgences. These forgave neither sins nor guilt, but only those earthly penalties that the Church, not secular rulers, had imposed. As to releasing souls from purgatory, the power of the Pope was limited to his prayers, beseeching God to apply to a dead soul the surplus merits of Christ and the saints. On November 28th, Luther issued an appeal from the judgment of the Pope to that of a general council. In that same month, Leo commissioned Karl von Miltitz, a young Saxon nobleman in minor orders in Rome, to take the Golden Rose to Frederick, and also to make a quiet effort to bring Luther, that child of Satan, back to obedience. On reaching Germany, Miltitz was astonished to find half the country openly hostile to the Roman See. Among his own friends in Augsburg and Nuremberg, 3 out of 5 were for Luther. In Saxony, anti-papal feeling ran so strong that he divested himself of all indications that he was a papal commissioner. When he met Luther at Altenburg on January 3, 1519, he found him more open to reason than to fear. Probably at this stage, Luther was sincerely anxious to preserve the unity of Western Christendom. He made generous concessions: to observe silence if his opponents would do likewise, to write a letter of submission to the Pope, to acknowledge publicly the propriety of prayers to the saints, the reality of purgatory, and the usefulness of indulgences in remitting canonical penances, and to recommend to the people a peaceful allegiance to the Church. Meanwhile, the details of the controversy were to be submitted for adjudication to some German bishop acceptable to both parties. Well pleased, Miltitz went to Leipzig, summoned Tetzel, reproved him for excesses, accused him of mendacity and embezzlement, and dismissed him. Tetzel retired to his monastery and died soon afterward on August 11, 1519. On his deathbed he received a kindly letter from Luther, assuring him that the indulgence sale was only an occasion, not a cause of the disturbance, that the affair had not been begun on that account, but that the child had quite another father. On March 3rd, Luther wrote to the Pope a letter of complete submission. Leo replied in a friendly spirit on March 29th, inviting him to come to Rome to make his confession and offering him money for the journey. However, with consistent inconsistency, Luther had written to Spalatin on March 13th, I am at a loss to know whether the Pope is Antichrist or his apostle. Under the circumstances, he thought it safer to stay in Wittenberg. There, the faculty, students, and citizens were predominantly friendly to his cause. He was especially happy to receive the support of a brilliant young humanist and theologian, whom the elector had appointed in 1518, at the age of 21, to teach Greek at the university. Philip Schwarzert, or Black Earth, had had his name Hellenized as Melanchthon by his great-uncle Reuchlin. A man of small stature, frail physique, halting gait, homely features, lofty brow, and timid eyes, this intellectual of the Reformation became so loved in Wittenberg that 500 or 600 students crowded his lecture room, and Luther himself, who described him as having almost every virtue known to man, humbly sat among his pupils. Melanchthon, said Erasmus, is a man of gentle nature. Even his enemies speak well of him. Luther enjoyed combat. Melanchthon longed for peace and conciliation. Luther sometimes chided him as immoderately moderate, but Luther's noblest and mildest side showed in his uninterrupted affection for one so opposed to him in temperament and policy. I have been born to war and fight with factions and devils, therefore my books are stormy and warlike. I must root out the stumps and stocks, cut away the thorns and hedges, fill up the ditches, and am the rough forester to break a path and make things ready. But Master Philip walks softly and silently, tills and plants, sows and waters with pleasure, as God has gifted him richly. Another Wittenberg professor shone with a fiercer light than Melanchthon's. Andreas Bodenstein, known from his birthplace as Karlstadt, had joined the university staff at the age of 24 in 1504. At 30 he received the chair of Thomistic philosophy and theology. On April 13, 1517, he anticipated Luther's historic protest by publishing 152 theses against indulgences. At first opposed to Luther, he soon turned into an ardent supporter. "Hotter in the matter than I," said the great rebel. When ex Obelici challenged Luther's theses, Karlstadt defended them in 406 propositions. One of these contained the first definite declaration in the German Reformation of the Bible's paramount authority over the decretals and traditions of the Church. Eck replied with a challenge to a public debate. Karlstadt readily agreed, and Luther made the arrangements. Eck then published a prospectus listing 13 theses which he offered to prove in the debate. One ran, "We deny that the Roman Church was not superior to other churches before the time of Sylvester. We have always recognized the possessor of Peter's chair as his successor and as the vicar of Christ." But it was not Karlstadt, it was Luther, who, in the Resolutiones, had raised the point that in the first centuries of Christianity the Roman See had no more authority than several other bishops of the Church. Luther felt himself challenged, and claimed that Eck's thesis freed him from his vow of silence. He determined to join Karlstadt in the theological tournament. In June 1519, the two warriors rode off to Leipzig, accompanied by Melanchthon and 6 other professors, and escorted in country carts by 200 Wittenberg students, armed and armored as if for battle. And in truth, they were entering territory hostile to Luther. In the great tapestried hall of Pleissenburg Castle, packed with excited spectators, and under the presidency of the Orthodox Duke George of Albertine Saxony, Eck and Karlstadt began the joust between the old and the new on June 27th. Hardly anyone in Leipzig cared that on the morrow a new emperor was to be elected at Frankfurt am Main. After Karlstadt had for days suffered under Eck's superior argumentative skill, Luther took the stand for Wittenberg. He was brilliant and powerful in debate, but recklessly candid. He denied emphatically the primacy of the Bishop of Rome in the early days of Christianity, and reminded his mostly antipathetic audience that the widespread Greek Orthodox Church still rejected the supremacy of Rome. When Eck charged that Luther's view echoed that of Hus, which the Council of Constance had condemned, Luther replied that even ecumenical councils could err, and that many doctrines of Hus were sound. When this debate ended on July 8th, Eck had accomplished his real purpose, to have Luther commit himself to a definite heresy. The Reformation now advanced from a minor dispute about indulgences to a major challenge of papal authority over Christendom. Eck passed on to Rome, presented to the Curia a report of the disputation, and recommended the excommunication of Luther. Leo was not so precipitate. He still hoped for some peaceable solution, and he was too distant from Germany to realize how far the revolt had gone. Prominent and respected citizens like Johann Holzschuher, Lazarus Spengler, and Willibald Pirkheimer spoke up for Luther. Dürer prayed for his success. The Humanists were sending forth a cloud of pamphlets satirizing the papacy with all the exuberant vituperation characteristic of the age. Ulrich von Hutten, on reaching Augsburg in 1518, turned his rhymes against Leo's call for crusading funds and expressed the hope that the collectors would go home with empty bags. When news came of the Leipzig debate, he hailed Luther as the liberator of Germany, and from that time his pen was a sword for the reform. He enlisted among Franz von Sickingen's knights, who were itching for revolution, and induced him to offer Luther all the support and protection that his armed band could provide. Luther replied in warm appreciation, but was not ready to use force in defense of his person. In March 1520, Hutten published an old German manuscript written in the time of the Emperor Henry IV, who reigned from 1056 to 1106, and supporting Henry in his struggle against Pope Gregory VII. He dedicated the book to the young Emperor Charles V, as a hint that Germany expected him to avenge Henry's humiliation and defeat. To free Germany from Rome, said Hutten, was of greater urgency than to repel the Turks. While our forefathers thought it unworthy of them to submit to the Romans when these were the most martial nation in the world, we not only submit to these effeminate slaves of lust and luxury, but suffer ourselves to be plundered to minister to their sensuality. In April 1520, Hutten issued the first of two series of Gespräche, verse dialogues that played a role second only to Luther's works in voicing and stimulating the national desire for independence from Rome. He described Rome as a gigantic blood-sucking worm, and declared that the Pope is a bandit chief, and his gang bears the name of the Church. Rome is a sea of impurity, a mire of filth, a bottomless sink of iniquity. Should we not flock from all quarters to compass the destruction of this common curse of humanity? Erasmus pleaded with Hutten to temper his style and gave him a friendly warning that he was in danger of arrest. Hutten hid himself in one after another of Sickingen's castles, but continued his campaign. To Elector Frederick, he recommended the secular appropriation of all monastic wealth and described the excellent uses to which Germany could put the money that was annually sent to Rome. But the center of the war remained in Little Wittenberg. In the spring of 1520, Luther published, with furious notes, an epitome in which he quoted the most recent and still uncompromising claims made by Orthodox theologians for the primacy and powers of the popes. Luther met extremes with extremes. If Rome thus believes and teaches with the knowledge of popes and cardinals, which I hope is not the case, then in these writings I freely declare that the true Antichrist is sitting in the temple of God and is reigning in Rome, that empurpled Babylon, and that the Roman Curia is the synagogue of Satan. If the fury of the Romanists thus goes on, there will be no remedy left except that the emperors, kings, and princes, girt about with force and arms, shall attack these pests of the world and settle the matter no longer by words but by the sword. If we strike thieves with the gallows, robbers with the sword, heretics with fire, why do we not much more attack in arms these masters of perdition, these cardinals, these popes, and all this sink of the Roman Sodom which has without end corrupted the Church of God, and wash our hands in their blood? Later in the same year, Karlstadt issued a little book, De Canonicis Scripturis Libellus, exalting the Bible over popes, councils, and traditions, and the Gospels over the epistles. If Luther had followed this last line, Protestantism might have been less Pauline, Augustinian, and predestinarian. The Libellus was ahead of its time in doubting the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and the full authenticity of the Gospels, but it was weak in its central argument. It decided the authenticity of biblical books by the traditions of the early centuries, and then rejected tradition in favor of the books so certified. Heartened by the support of Melanchthon and Karlstadt, Hutten and Sickingen, Luther wrote to Spalatin on June 11, 1520, "I have cast the die." This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.